leg raise.
And we're live.
Nice. And line squat. Trunk stability. Push up. Leg stability. Nice. Cool. So we're going to do, I'm going to go over like assessment stuff. I'm going to back it up a little. So when I come in here, like very quickly, I can figure out where somebody is and what they need and how much they need. And so I'm able to notice a little bit more things. So these are one of the ways, like Gray, this guy who's taught me personally, this was a big game changer for me. He has these basic pyramids on how he views members or athletes, and it allows us to figure out what they need, how much they need, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'll kind of give a visual, and then when you're coaching people, kind of see where they fit in here, and that allows me to know, like, I can push this hard or I can't push that hard and things like that. Okay, and then we'll also touch on the FMS, which is a screening. I think the most important thing, and it's something Mike talks about too, is every single exercise without exception is an assessment if you know what you're looking for, if you notice the right things, okay? So first one is, there's basically 3 levels, right? This is optimally where you should be. There's like the base, right? And that's kind of like your functional movement, right? It's a nice wide base. Then after that, you kind of have what you call is like your fitness, your performance, things like that. And then on top of that, you have like your skill. This is like athletic skill. It could be like your basketball, so on and so forth. You see this nice wide base, it gives a buffer, right? And so, you have this nice wide base that gives you a buffer zone that protects you. So you're basically like a car that can control and steer, right? A high performance car that can control and steer. You got this nice wide base. This is pretty much where I am, right? I have this nice functional movement, and so that I can play with things a little bit more, okay? Nice wide base, gives you a buffer zone. You put that fitness, that strength and conditioning on top of it, losing weight, and then on the top is pretty much like your athletic skill. This is optimally where we want to be. If you have somebody that has this nice wide base, they're not leaking energy, you can push them a little bit more, right? Does that make sense? Now, the issue is, I'll cover different pyramids, and then I'll cover how I decide how to determine which pyramid they are, right? So the next one is this kind of like what we call the overpowered pyramid. Look, they have a smaller base, right? So it's basically this big, but they're super strong, right? You see this? Functional movement, strength, power, and then there's skill. You see this? This base is not wide enough to have a buffer zone here. Does that make sense? So like this, they can control this much of their strength and conditioning and their power. They can't control this one because they don't have the functional capacity to control it, right? Does that make sense? So the person you mentioned, they're missing this. And so I can't play with that person as much as the other person. You have to shut it down a little bit more. Does that make sense? So this is somebody who's kind of either overpowered or not as functional as they should be. So always think about that platform. This is what Gray calls putting strength on top of dysfunction, right? You're playing with the dragon's tail here. So anytime I come in and somebody, I'll give you that example you told me about, that person was putting strength on top of dysfunction. And you're going to have to pay for it eventually. Okay, does that make sense? And then the next one, boom. Underpowered. Okay, the next one is somebody who's got a nice functional base, but they don't have much strength or conditioning, right? It's pretty small. Functional. And their skills here, right? They got this nice wide base, but they're not doing that much with it.
Right.
They might be like really good in movement, but they can't do a chin-up. They can't do this. They get out of breath very easily. This is somebody who would probably spend less time on foam rolling, less time on the corrective stuff. We'll put it in like they'll do something that's a strength exercise and right after do like a mobility or flexibility exercise. Does that make sense? So we can spend less time on here, right? We have certain members, they got a nice wide bottom base. Like I don't have them do that much corrective stuff.
Right.
Does that make sense? But they need to really get stronger, get more conditioning, and the skill, again, that's kind of, we can also put this as like activities of daily living too as well, okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. And so that would be the underpowered performance pyramid. Then we also have like the underskilled, and that's more for like skill coaches or sports, right? Yeah, so for example, this person's super strong, great conditioning, they got good functional movement, but their crossover sucks, right? So that's something we deal with less too as well. Any questions on any of these pyramids?
Not so far. I think they all pretty much make sense.
Right.
It's like I can definitely see individuals that they relate.
Right? Yeah. And so again, the first level is the functional level. This is kind of your platform. And this is a combination of like mobility, stability, all that good stuff. Ideally, it needs to be nice and wide so that it can control and steer everything you put on top of it, right? Otherwise, you're like a teenager in a Ferrari that has all the horsepower in the world, but like can't control it, right? And then on top of that, it's kind of like the skill set stuff. So whenever you're coaching somebody, always put them in one of these categories. Do they have this nice buffer zone? Or are they a small base and then they're overpowered and they don't have that protection in this area? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? And so like how do we determine how to put them in what category? You got to have some type of understanding of like movement mechanics. One of the tests we use is like the FMS. It's like functional movement screen. This was developed by Gray and Lee. I've been with them many times, and it's a screening process, right? So like one screen can save you like weeks of like repair, okay? And when I'm screening for many things. First and foremost is pain. Second one is like asymmetry. I'll break this down in a second. And then it's movement. These are actually in level of importance, right? Why is this important? Because what's the leading cause of injury? Previous injury. What's the second leading cause of injury? Asymmetry between left and right sides. So, for example, you got left, you got right. It's the shoulder, whatever. The second leading cause of injury is an asymmetry between like mobility and flexibility on sides.
I'd say 9 times out of 10, my injuries, like the other day, like anytime I'm like carrying kegs or whatever, it's asymmetry.
Right. So
I'm off balance and doing a thing that is way too strenuous for.
Right, so exactly. So you have the example of the mom who's like, I just hold him all this time. And so there's an asymmetry at play. So I'm going to give some notes here. Corrective needs to be asymmetric. Okay, and so again, first things first, is there pain? Is there previous injury? The leading cause of injury is previous injury and pain. The second leading cause of injury is asymmetry between left and right sides. And we got to figure out if that asymmetry is like a mobility asymmetry, a stability asymmetry, if it's a load asymmetry, right? Carrying, boxes of this on the right side, because we got to know, like, if there's a dysfunction in one area, you can't make them do a weighted exercise. You're going to put strength on top of dysfunction. Okay, does that make sense? And so the FMS is this one system, and it's basically allows us to screen for pain and asymmetry and movement patterns. And there's a score criteria. We'll break it down in another video. I'll just give an overview. There's 3 scores. There's a 3, 2, 1, and 0. Okay, 3 is basically, it's like perfect, it looks good, nice range of motion. 2 is, it's mostly good, but there's some dysfunction. 1 is like, it just looks like shit. Right? It's really bad. 0 is when there's a pain. Anytime there's pain, right off the bat, you get a 0. Does that make sense? And so if I know, like, fill in the blank movement pattern is like a 1 or a 2, I'm going to attack it. And I'm going to clear it before we start loading. Because this gives rise to, like, pattern recognition. Because on these tests, I'll kind of break down. I know if that person looks like this, I know what's going to happen more than likely. Does that make sense? Any questions on this hierarchy of pain, asymmetry, and movement?
I think it all pretty much makes sense, obviously because mostly I've experienced it.
Yeah. And why this is also super important, because they've done, I'll give you 2 real world examples. So I can't remember which coach it was, but he forget his name, but he was the coach for the Atlanta Falcons, and he did the FMS on one of the star players, and he's like, dude, like, you're like a 1, like, it's not good. And there was an ego battle because the dude was like, no, but I want to lift heavier. He was like, let me give you, I'll make you a bet. No, it was a snatch. Don't snatch for 4 weeks. We're just going to work on improving your score. Yeah. And he was super hesitant. He was like, just trust me, give me 4 weeks. They worked on other strength stuff, but not on the snatch. They improved his score. They retested him, and what happened? He got a PR, a personal record. Why? Because he was putting strength on top of dysfunction. So when you become more efficient in this stuff, you're able to feel it more, and at least decreases the likelihood of injury. Okay? Super important. Another weird, freaky thing about this, they've done a bunch of studies on the FMS. And what they found, they did a lot of studying on, boot camp for Army Rangers. And there's a certain cutoff score in the FMS. I think it's 13. I think there's 13 out of 21 memory-wise. And what they found was people that scored 13 or less, I think it was either double or quadruple the percentage of them dropping out of boot camp. Really? So there's something possibly neurologically going on. Right? It's pretty weird, right? So super important. There's these tests, and the things we're looking for, again, pain, asymmetry, movement, and also what type of asymmetry. Is it mobility or stability or flexibility? That's super important, because if one person has shoulder pain because it's a mobility issue, you better give them a mobility solution. Here's the inverse. If their shoulder pain is caused from a stability issue and you feed it mobility, guilty, right? So you got to be able to match, and that's what I'm really good at. I'm really good at looking at somebody and like, more than likely there's the issue, let me confirm it, okay, confirm, feed it what it needs, okay? And so what Mike talks about, he doesn't use the FMS like it's totally prescribed for other reasons. It just doesn't work good in our model, but you can use the principles at all times. So there's several ones. It's the overhead squat, which we kind of do in our assessment. It gives a lot of clues of things. There's a hurdle step, which is basically like you're doing this, and next time we'll go over the actual FMS, and you're basically going over here, stepping over. What you're looking for is that hip flexion. Is it functional or dysfunctional? You're also looking at if the back moves or not. And when you do this test, it's uncanny. I'll be able to predict. I'm like, you got right back pain. How'd you know? It shows me, right? And so like if this is dysfunctional, so like if you can't get hip flexion, you're gonna get it from your back, right? So whenever I'm doing movement in here, I always see the FMS, even though it's not the FMS, right? So this looks at your hip flexion pattern, and can you move an extremity and not have your back move? Because if you can't, I can't be giving you certain exercises, okay? And this is where I'm able to predict things because I recognize all these patterns. Shoulder mobility, and that's another one. It's basically like a test here. You go here, and you kind of measure. I actually have an asymmetry on this side, right? And most people have an asymmetry, but it's got to be within like the one deviation of the hand. Okay. My memory serves me correct. Most women, their hand length is about 6 inches. Men is about anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5 inches, right? If you measure the actual hand, right? And so that's another thing. Is it a mobility or stability issue? There's one where you're kind of laying on the ground and here, right? And this is actually we need to start doing again, because if they can't do this, like basically right here, look at my bottom leg raise. If they're doing this,
and that comes up,
they're gonna suck at deadlifts.
Yeah.
Because this is basically, this pattern is a single leg deadlift pattern, okay? Inline lunge, it should be called a split squat, but basically we get them here in this balanced position. A lot of people won't even be able to handle this position, so they're not a good candidate for lunges. And we just have them lunge down and up, kind of like on a board. And we'll see a lot of things. If they hinge forward, they have ankle issues, and just having them do that, I know exactly where to start them. Does that make sense? So I'm noticing. Another thing is a trunk stability push-up. It's not a test for your strength. It's more of a test. We start them here, and then we have them do a push-up. Is their back straight, or does it bend like this, right? Does it do that? I know if it excessively bends, I know that we're going to play with the dragon's tail. I know they should not be prescribed exercises that are moving their core, right? Does that make sense? And then there could be one level where it's like kind of bad, but if you teach them a technique, it gets better. They're still at risk. And then there's people where it's so atrocious that there's certain things we simply cannot do. And if you don't notice these things, you don't understand why injuries happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's another one, trunk stability. You know, Mike is the example of the wide receiver. Mm-hmm. I think I remember meeting the wide receiver that went to... He couldn't do a rotate. It's basically, there's a plank here, and here's one version of it, and then it's the same version where you're kind of doing the same side, like this. Yeah. And this guy's in the NFL. He played for the Colts. And he literally could not do it. Literally could not do it. And then Mike was like, oh, here. And it seems counterintuitive because people that are like sometimes really high level athletes, their athleticism masks and lets them get away with stuff, but they're eventually going to get injured, okay?
They're very good at one thing.
Yeah, they're overpowered. And so there's certain levels to it. If they can't maintain a certain level of efficiency, I know that this list of exercises is not only inappropriate, but is dangerous. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Take you out of a season dangerous.
Yeah, it's super. And so like a really good coach should be able to justify every single exercise without exception. What's the thought process for it? Why are you giving it to it? And the challenging thing is combining this world with the aesthetic world. Because a lot of our members here, they want to work the back of the arms and this and that, and it's all good. I remember being at Boston University. This is when Mike was teaching the team. They just literally just won the national title in hockey, and he's notorious for like it's got to be functional, it's got to be this. And I remember watching the workout with them, and he comes to me and he says, "This is the last set, but stay and watch this." I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Check this out. Those fucking 5 dudes are just gonna start hitting core like crazy." So his philosophy was like, you do my workout, it's the vegetables, and then you can do the dessert afterwards, right? Because these are athletes, their goal is to get into the NHL. But then like afterwards, they just started doing all this like stuff like this, and he's like, they're gonna do it anyways. As long as I clean up their movement pattern, they can do that a little. Does that make sense? Cool, so that is the screening process. What are some of the things in here that look like an FMS but is not the FMS? I'll give you one example. One of my favorite tests to do with people is just a knee hug. This is the hurdle, right? So right off the bat, if they're doing this, varying degree, I know what to teach them first, and I know what I shouldn't give them. Right. Does that make sense? So it's like knee hug, boom. Are they able to do this stuff, or is it this? Right.
Standing upright.
Right. And so I think one of the things we need to, we'll inject here is do a lot of at least we'll inject more of the corrective exercises in the warm-ups. Yeah. So proactively improving these movement patterns, okay? And there's a way to do this, and one of the ways to do this is more power grounding, but also pre-activate your core. And then move that stuff. Does that make sense?
No, it does, yeah.
And so like, always when you're coaching people, when legs are moving, like what's happening here? Is it a straight clean movement, or is there compensation, right? What else here? So shoulder mobility. Somebody has really bad shoulder mobility. You're playing with fire with stuff up here. You're playing with fire upstairs here too as well. What else? Any questions on this stuff?
No, just like inline. Is that say inline squat?
Yeah, inline lunge. So it's basically we get them on this very narrow bar, and they got to here. And I want to see, do they hinge forward? Does this hurt? Is there pain? Anything like that?
I liked what he was saying, and it started to make like all these things started to click as far as like, okay, like the most very basic thing is, you know, think about an exercise as far as like just kind of on the weight bench where you're actually just doing like leg extension, like pushing out with a weight plate. What is that? Like when you're on when you're completely supine and you're pushing out that way with a leg press.
Yeah, leg press. Okay.
So that's like the basics of a squat, but you're stabilizing everything and you're still relying on the machine to keep you stable. So the only movements that you're making are here, and then you graduate to maybe standing, but doing it on a machine as well, and then eventually you graduate to just straight standing, and then you take out the stability of the machine.
Yeah.
But then progressing, because he's like, how many exercises, how many sports do you actually do
right.
that are just two
legs?
Right. So really getting any opportunity to do either half kneeling or split or lateral, you're really going to start to actually test the body that way, because then you're taking out all of those insurance policies basically.
Yeah.
So those things, when I've looked at people's programs and even in my own exercise program, as far as like being able to say like, what is this doing for me? Why am I doing half kneeling instead of tall kneeling? Why am I doing, split instead of double? Because I feel like I'm getting more out of this or that. But like looking at that, it's like all of those things started to like.
Yeah, cool. And to the point, like when you're on double leg stance, there's certain things that you don't have to engage, but when you're on a single leg stance, it's especially like a true unsupported, now all these things are in the play. And it's like, these are almost like the reserve army. And it's like, oh shit, we're being called up. So that single leg stance. Another cool thing about, I'll give you an example, is if somebody does not know how to handle the split stance or this, I'll trick their body. I'll get them into this. And so what does this mimic? It mimics a single leg stance, right? And then what do I further do? I activate their core as they're in this stance. So I'm baby stepping them to eventually do this. Right? And so that's how I can take somebody pretty quickly who's like, I can never do this. I'm like, give me 5 minutes, you'll do it, okay? And so if you know these principles from the ground up, you would take you take joints out of the equation, build it up, and then you go further. And one of the techniques you use is like, can you grab a stick for me in that corner for me, please? And then a blue mat. Nice. Good. Thank you. And so there's a concept I learned from Craig. This dude's like, what I learned from him, he was one of the rare coaches that within like 30 seconds you'd be like, that wasn't real. And one of the concepts he taught me was called firewire seal. Right? He would literally take people's knee pain and like it'd be gone within a second. And it's just that we're looking at each other like, what just happened here? And so somebody can't balance here. They're like wobbly like this. One of the things I do is I take them down. I try to mimic that position with less weight bearing. Right? So look, I don't have to, here I'm bearing all my weight. Right? Here I'm not bearing all my weight, but I'm in kind of that stance. And so another thing is, how do you determine whether, like, I'll give an example. Somebody can't squat to here, and they'll say, I'm not strong enough. I'm like, yeah, maybe. Or let's figure out if it's a mobility or stability issue, right? And this principle, it helps with everything else. So if they can lay on their back and do this, they have the mobility. This is a squat. So if you turn me right side up, this is a squat. I'm like, okay, you don't have the core stability to do this because the body will not allow you to do what you can't control, right? And so one of the things I'll do to get people better is this half kneeling stance, squeeze that butt. And what I do is I say, I want you to push the stick into the floor and it activates the core. And now I'm teaching my body to activate my core. I'm tuning that muscle for weight bearing as I'm in a single leg stance. Does that make sense? So it's like, I'm teaching. I'm like, and then I'll have them play with this. And then I fired it. And then I might give them some assistance on the TRX. I fire it. I wire it. And then if appropriate, I'll add some slight weight to seal it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's a concept. So basically, take a joint out of the equation, teach them how to fire stuff. This is a great tool. Push it into the ground. We'll add some of this. This also teaches you to pack. It's like drive and then move forward nice and tall. Does that make sense?
For sure.
Yeah.
I would never even do that.
Yeah, so there's some other cool stuff I'll show you too. Really good concepts of firewire seal where it's like night and day. It's like a magic trick, okay? Any other questions on this?
What does the very bottom one say?
Rotary stability.
Rotary stability.
So that's your ability to move your extremities and not freaking tilt over.
Okay.
Right? Does that make sense? And so if somebody has a glaring asymmetry or just can't control, you got to be able to say, all right, I need you to be able to learn how to control stuff. Because 9 out of 10 times somebody has back pain, they simply can't control their core. It's again, more movement is more detrimental to the core than not, you know? And then let's actually, if you go to that coach shift report and see if there's like 1 or 2 people, an example of like some red issue, that I can apply to this so that we can go even more real world?
Okay. So not being able to do box jumps.
Okay.
Neck pain.
Because of neck pain?
Yeah.
The person starts with a J?
Yeah.
I think it's the impact.
Okay.
I think it's the impact.
I thought, but I wasn't sure, and it's like there seems to be a lot of things happening with that person lately that are shoulder and neck and back.
Yeah.
Just was
Eh.
having issues a lot, like last week.
Yeah, and a lot of like that person's issues have dramatically decreased because she's no longer with really shitty coaches. I would say very negligent coaches. There's rare times I'll say something, but like if somebody's negligent, it's very similar to like seeing an instructor who's teaching somebody how to drive, but they're swerving in and out of lanes. It's actually unethical not to call that out. So that stuff has gone down a lot. And here's the other issue. Think joint by joint approach. Do a snapshot of that person's anatomy. So this is a perfect tie into the joint by joint approach. So if I had 3 people that if I just looked at their posture, I would more than likely say that person has neck issues.
Yeah.
So what am I thinking? So remember the joint by joint approach, right? And so we have the cervical spine, we refer out to like Dr. Thomas, and then we have the T-spine, right? And what does that person's T-spine look like?
Yeah.
This. What happens when you don't have, so your thoracic spine is designed for mobility. What happens when you don't have mobility? It compresses this area. And then you are, that person is this. They have the small base. That person's pretty strong. I mean, workhorse. But look, she has smaller buffer zone. Why? Because her thoracic spine is this. And that decreases this space. It decreases the nerve ending space. And it's pushing on that. Does that make sense? And so part of that is years and years of just having that posture. So again, that's a person who has a smaller base, and then there's certain things we can't play with her because she just has this, and it's going to take years to get that to even open up.
I was going to say, what are ways, because like I worry about having that happen. Like I've had my chiropractor and even like a massage therapist be like this is super tight and
Right.
because you're just being pulled in this way. You need to open this up.
Right.
What are things that I can do to help open that up and continue to strengthen? I mean, is that like a back burner? Is that reverse flies? Is that?
It's a good question. So it's a combination of several things. And like I wouldn't say yours is excessive, but you might have more symptoms than the other person.
Yeah.
So there's several things, right? And like I think it would help to do the shoulder mobility test on you to get some numbers that's quantifiable. But there's several things. Just look at that area as the front, and then it's the back, right? We have the T-spine, we have the chest stuff. We also have your diaphragm, that's kind of like that. And so we gotta do several things. There's several systems. Very underrated is your breathing. Super underrated. This is what mediocre coaches, so we talked about the 3 things of becoming a great coach, right? It's attitude, it's time, and the ability to notice things others don't notice. And this is where it starts. So breathing, I'll touch on that in a second, because a lot of people, here's another thing I would almost guarantee with that person, her breathing is more up here.
Yeah.
Her breathing is less in the diaphragm. Okay, and so there's breathing, we'll touch on that. Then there's the soft tissue component, right? And then there's the flexibility. of the soft tissue. And then there's the mobility of the joint. And then there's the retractors. May not be spelling that right, but whatever. So first thing first, believe it or not, I'd work on the breathing. So I think actually doing more of this. So in coaching, you'll notice some things. Over the years, it's like a sports team. There's some things I'll program for a while, and then whatever reason, stop programming. It's just life, okay? And what we did for a while, we do a lot of breathing exercises. Because what I noticed was, anytime there was a back issue with somebody, their breathing was dysfunctional. They would breathe here, up top here. And why is that important? Because if your breathing's dysfunctional, it actually pulls your core out of alignment and your diaphragm out of alignment. Okay? And also, if your breathing's dysfunctional, what happens? It overstresses these muscles. It's like here, breathing, overstressing that. And when you do a big deep breath, it's excessive, but you're doing small little breaths throughout the day. It's high volume, and it's just constantly pulling on this. That's another reason. So first things first, I'd test your breathing, and then I'd give you some diaphragmatic breathing exercises as you're pulling this back and down. And there's some really cool exercises we can do that I learned from the Stanford strength and conditioning team, right? Best in the world. I remember one time I worked out, I was there with the soccer team, the national champions. And they spent 5 minutes on their fucking breathing. And I was like, why? And it's like, because this, and this. Because we notice when people have issues, the breathing sucks. And this is why. And so number one, we'll test your breathing. We'll get you to do diaphragmatic breathing as you pull all the shit back down. Right? Does that make sense? Because if you fix all this, but your breathing's off, it's shoveling shit upstream. Okay? Then we got to work on the soft tissue. We got to work on the soft tissue on the front and the back. And so the big one to work on is your pec minor. Because if this is super tight, pulls this forward. Okay? So work on the soft tissue on the front, work on the soft tissue on the back. There's a massive one, and what's the issue again specifically?
Basically, he said that this area right here on both sides is very tight and it's pulling this forward. So we need to work on keeping this open, like opening this up and pulling it back.
Another massive one, it's the most painful thing I've seen grown men cry, probably me included, is there a trigger point underneath here called I think it's the subscapularis. It's super painful, but it's almost a relieved nerve. And it's
like something that you pinch and you feel in your brain? You'll know when you have it because it's literally the most painful thing. It's insane. It's in here. So that's another thing to possibly work on. And then the flexibility, like you're stretching the pec minor, all these things. And these are, by the way, ideally like 2-minute holds. So I think we need to experiment with maybe even fewer stretches, but longer sustained holds. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then mobility of your thoracic spine. Because here's the issue. Sometimes people will try to solve issues by just doing flexibility. But if your thoracic spine is not mobile, again, you're shoveling shit upstream. Does that make sense? And then also the retractors. So like the actual shoulder blades are retracting. And so you got to like activate that stuff and then seal it with some strength exercises and sustain holds, right? And it seems like a lot, but you can probably get all this stuff down with 2 exercises. Okay. Right? It seems like a lot, but like you can combine these things. I can probably design 2 exercises that solves both these 2 things. But the first thing is the principle. Attack the breathing, the soft tissue, the flexibility, the mobility of the joints, and then the retractors, the things that pull you back. Does that make sense? So it's basically, you ever seen tug of war? Yep. Idea is to have the flag in the middle. Yeah. So we got to figure out, it looks like your flag is more in the front. Does that make sense? Of course.
And so
it has been for 20 years.
right, for 20 years. And so these are the forces at play. So we need to get every person who's pulling on that rope to do their job. Not just breathing, not just this, not just this, not this, just all of them. And we can do that in 2 exercises that we can design. So I think it's a good discussion to probably do some of these correctives. And so if you want to come over here on the camera, here's a good one to do, right? Because a lot of times people don't know how to breathe, and you'll even show them how to breathe and they'll do a dysfunction. So I always like to give somebody a target. So like if you turn around, right, and face that way, what I'm going to do is you're going to go like this. And you're going to breathe in and out, but here's the key. You got to drive your elbows into my hands. Breathe in and out in your belly, but then we feel the pressure, see? Because relax for a second. So what you did, I didn't feel the pressure, and then what happened? This went up.
Yeah.
Right? And so I need to constantly feel that pressure, right? So breathe in and out. I want more pressure on my hands. More. Drive, right? Right, drive, and then more. Good. And that's a way, like you see, because that pattern is so automatic in you, right? You went up there, that's your default.
It's up here.
Yeah, and so we need to have, maybe even we just have holding strength, right? I want you to push, hold more, right? And give them that feedback. So that's another good one, because I even told you to do it, and it's automatic.
Oh, it is, completely. I didn't even realize it. I'm like,
right.
Yeah, why would, but
yeah. And so that's a good partner one of like, you do it on me, right? And then if I don't breathe in, you got to feel pressure. So it's like, am I pressuring enough? Yeah, cool. So like, you got to give them the feedback. It's like, I don't even feel you. You're not even pushing. And it's like, oh, okay, there. So that target-based stuff. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So that's a good partner exercise to do. And you can get this done pretty quick too.
Awesome.
Does that kind of help?
Yeah.
Cool. So we'll design that for you. And we'll design that for the people with those issues. Let's do like one more person who's in the red category.
Okay. Let's see here. Sacral pain. Let's see, shoulder tendon. Wow, that's good.
Okay. What's the name start with?
Sacral pain. E.
I know who it is.
Yeah.
So that person definitely, is there any other notes on there too?
From last workout. Sacral pain from last workout.
So it's a combination of stuff. Can we grab a program? Yeah. I have some ideas, but I want to confirm them with the program. Nice, thank you. Do you remember this person's assessment too, by any chance?
No.
So that'd be another piece of additional information that would definitely help too. So boom. Do we know what's?
I know if this person has issues, upper back, knees back, neck from, has had whiplash injury.
Oh wow, that sucks.
Yeah.
So that's again
Current, but past.
Yeah, pre-existing, and I think what was also pre-existing was left ankle, the neck, as you mentioned, and the right knee. The other thing to mention too is this person sits on average 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
Like literally 10 hours a day. So that's huge too as well. And so I think, so one of the things I'll avoid with this person is limit the bike, limit the impact on the lower body too as well. It could literally be that she's just sitting too long, right? And so there's less things we can do with her. So what I would do is actually more unloaded stuff, right? So instead of like a hip thrust where you're pushing into the ground, because I got to lift my weight, right, we can literally do this stuff where it's here, lock it in, press, and extend.
Is that head down, knee bend, quad extension?
Yeah, it's quad extension, and see if that works with her, okay? Because it literally might be a combination of a pre-existing injuries, her sitting a lot. And so again, why is that performance pyramid so effing important, right? Yeah. Because this person is like this. Their base is here, right? Yeah. It's even smaller. It's like this, boom. And then this is small, and then this is small, right? Yeah. Most people should have this base. And so this is definitely somebody, what's good is she's like actually self-aware about this, which is awesome. But then you have people with this small base. Do you ever seen the thing that that meme that the cat is looking in the mirror and thinks it's a lion? That's sometimes good, sometimes bad. Okay, so this person has that small base. So like whenever I coach this person, I'm super conservative. I'm like, my main goal is just to increase this base. That's my only goal with this person. Because that person has so much pre-existing stuff. My goal is not to get her in shape. That's my second goal. But you could do both at the same time. So that's where the functional paranoia gets ramped up, right? Does that make sense?
When I have worked with her, trying to do more things that are more like, let's stabilize everything we possibly can, isolate muscles to work. So
that, and also we would say, for example, if there's 2 upper body exercises, 2 core exercises, and then 2 lower body exercises, I'm decreasing the ratio of the lower body strength exercises that increases the impact forces on her. Okay. Does that make sense? And so that's super important. Like, so there's, and we'll end with this and go a little over there after this, is so FMS, I did, like in programming, here's the worlds that collide. It's like the strength and conditioning functional world, but also the aesthetic world. Ideally, you should have like a ratio of like every knee dominant, you have a hip dominant, every pull, you have a push. As long as there's no dysfunctional, we can break that rules, because let's be honest, girls want bigger butts. That's what they tell us. They're very blunt about this. Guys want bigger arms. And so there's times where you can break the rules as long as they got a nice little base here, right? With her, we literally would take down -1 lower body stuff. Does that make sense?
Definitely more focused on wanting to be stronger in her upper body.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is like prevent injury.
Yep.
From reoccurring.
Yep. Yeah, and again, she came in with pre-existing stuff, so it's literally first priority, even more so, is increase this stuff too as well. So I think part of the solution, well, actually what I think brought it on, it's a combination of, look, sitting literally 10 hours a day, and she says she's working about 5-6 days a week. That's a lot. She's starting behind the starting line, so she's going to be more at risk aggravating that stuff. So I would take anything out that has her sitting down. She sits enough. Yeah. And then I would take away one of the exercises on the lower body. Does that make sense? Yeah. So nothing that puts pressure here. Mm-hmm. So again, maybe even this might be too much. Maybe we have her do TRS assisted squats. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. Things like that. Any other questions and here's the other thing too, is with this person, I always ask myself the question, what am I going to regret more? Right. Having that person stop 1 rep, 1 set less, or go too far, right? So this is, again, why it's so important to visualize those pyramids. She's that pyramid. We need to get her big versus somebody else who has a nice wide base. We can play with them a little bit more. Cool. Maybe we'll do one little, maybe easy, quick one, and we'll end with there. And it doesn't have to be a red thing. It could be like a green thing or a blue thing too as well.
Just anybody with knee pain. Knee pain, lots of walking.
Yeah, so that person starts with an R.
Yep.
See how I know everything? Yeah. The more you know, the more you can do, right? The greater, then it's like a weird analogy. It's ones and zeros in the matrix. You're like slow motion. And so she came in pre-existing with this, pre-existing, but also what I asked her was like, what aggravated, she basically said she walked 5 miles on concrete with her sister. Okay. And I said, look, I'm not telling you to stop doing that because like there's other reasons why you need to be with this person. I'm saying you need to modify how often and how long you do. Super important. A lot of this stuff is like the game of blackjack. You know what the game of blackjack? The goal is to come as close to 21 without busting. And it's the same thing with the body. Some people's systemically, they have not that many chips, so they can't bust as much. Does that make sense? And then there's other people, nice wide base, they got this huge bankroll, and they can afford the bust from time to time. So that's macro. Then we have micro, which is somebody has a nice wide base up here, but their knee is wah, wah, wah. And so that person needs to push or hold at 15. Does that make sense? And so like with that person, she shouldn't be doing any like single leg knee dominant stuff. Even if she can and wants to, it's just we have to take away anything that's known to affect that too. So it's more hip dominant. Does that make sense? So if somebody has knee issues, you again take away single leg hip dominant and you shift the ratio to hip, you take out knee dominant, and you shift the ratio to hip dominant. Okay? Cool, we can end on that. You can hit like share, and then like if you can save it too.
We've been live,
so it'd be a right there. To the end. Then end.